Welcome everyone, or welcome back to the Kaldor Centre Conference. I'm Lauren Martin and I'll be your chair for this session, A Better Conversation, Changing the Public Discourse about Refugees. Considering the topics, it's especially fitting to begin by honouring the traditional owners of country in Australia and their continuing connection to land, water and community. I'd like to acknowledge the custodians of the Gadigal lands where I am today. I pay my respect to their elders past and present and extend that respect to any Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islanders who are with us online today. We have an amazing panel for you. Brief intros can only hint at all they've done, but here goes. Barat Batoor is a photographer and filmmaker who's been published in Newsweek, The Wall Street Journal, The Guardian, Stern, India Today, and more. I'm proud to have published his work in the Global Mail, and for those photos, he won Australia's prestigious Walkley Award. If you've seen his award-winning film Batoor, A Refugee's Journey, then you've also seen his brave project for the Washington Post, The Dancing Boys of Afghanistan. The film itself was a finalist for another Walkley, and it is so moving and thought-provoking. If you haven't seen it, please seek it out. Next, communication strategist Tom Heshemi. Tom is all about better connecting policy experts and the public. His experience ranges from NATO and the OECD to KPMG and the global PR firm Edelman. He is now the managing partner at Cast from Clay. It's an agency founded by people who were troubled about the failure of experts to engage the public on Brexit and the retreat of meaningful, well-informed perspectives. What a great response to that referendum result. Finally, best-selling author Amanda Ripley is an investigative journalist and host of the Slate podcast, How To. When she asked her fellow journalists, what if we covered controversial issues differently, based on how humans actually behave when they are polarized and suspicious? Her question became a touchstone for the Solutions Journalism movement. Amanda also co-founded Good Conflict, a company that creates workshops and content to help people get smarter about how they fight. And her latest book is High Conflict, Why We Get Trapped and How We Get Out. And again, I really can't recommend it highly enough. Thank you all for being here. The plan is for about 40 minutes of moderated discussion with the speakers, followed by 15 minutes of audience Q&A. But please feel free to post questions through the Q&A function at any time, and we'll try and integrate them as we go. Now, really goes without saying that in 2022 we are increasingly polarized, internationally, in the domestic politics of many of our countries, and even in our homes. Our debates are warped by people out for political gain and by algorithms out for profit. The power of grievance is on show everywhere. In Australia, Europe, the US, and really elsewhere, we've seen leaders exploit that general grievance and bring it to bear on refugees and people seeking asylum. And at the same time, the voices of refugees themselves are being heard more than ever. It's complicated. So let's start by digging deeper into the current state of play and where we are today. Batoor, let's start with you. Going back to the theme of the conference, would you say that we are at a turning point for the narrative about refugees? And if so, which way are we heading and who's driving it?
Thank you very much, Lauren. Before I start, I would like to acknowledge I would like to start by acknowledging the traditional owners of the land that I'm dialing from, which is the land of the Bunurong people of the Kulin Nations, and I pay my respect to their elders, past and present, and I acknowledge that this land has never been ceded. I think yes, and we have clearly witnessed in the last election that people rejected the politics of fear and division, And in the last 3 terms of the Liberal government, they used every tactic to punish people seeking asylum and refugees. They were punished in every way possible, like mentally, financially, socially, and even physically, by incarcerating them illegally and indefinitely. So they were demonized and were taken on to the point that we all witnessed several cases of self-harm. And we also saw that public pressure were enormous and great in support of those detained in offshore detentions, in hotel detentions, how amazing the support for the Home to Below campaign was. You might remember how the former Prime Minister Scott Morrison used the fear tactic to the last minute of the election campaign by leaking the news about the bird interception, but they miserably failed, and Australian public said a big no to this approach. Last year in August, when the president of Afghanistan symbolically escaped from Afghanistan, we received an overwhelming support from the wider Australian public, like faith groups, sports people, politicians, artists, human rights activists, professionals, ordinary public, and students. Like, they have been amazing in throwing their support to the diaspora community from Afghanistan and to put pressure on the government to take action for Afghanistan, to do something more. And at the Action for Afghanistan campaign, the key refugee sector organizations supported enormously, and without this support, the campaign could not be so powerful that we have been involved and very active for over a year. Other refugee campaigns which were driven by values-based messaging, where refugees and people seeking asylum have been the center voices. They have contributed greatly to change the narrative, to change the negative narrative about refugees. The recent polling support of permanent protection is another example, and clearly shows that it is a turning point, and we are heading towards the right direction of a fairer and more compassionate society. But I should say that this is just the beginning, and more work are needed to be done. The previous government has done a great damage to, and it will need a lot of work and time to undo it, to repair it. In this process, the refugee voices need to be at the forefront. They need to be heard, and they need to guide where the movement should go, how they should be treated, how the narrative should be. And I think refugees and people seeking asylum are slowly getting in control of the driving wheel, with the help of organizations, individuals, and supporters who truly believe that narrative about refugees should be told and led by refugees and people seeking asylum. I myself, I'm a coordinator of a program at the Asylum Seeker Resource Center that provides, we conduct training for people seeking asylum and refugees. It provides the opportunity for people with lived experience of seeking asylum to get trained to become the leaders of their community. I think this is a big and impactful investment. So hopefully we will have more refugee leaders in coming years who will be the true leaders of refugee movements and will change the refugee narrative for good. And I'm sure, like other organizations, more people are involved in upskilling, empowering people, and investing more into refugee movement, like to refugees to get the skills to be in power of changing the narrative. And this is the turning point.
That's so great. Thank you. It's amazing to start on a somewhat positive note. Amanda, if I could turn to you next, because I think in terms of shaping the narrative about refugees, we're talking often about journalists. Journalists and the media shape so much of our thinking, and we know that journalists take facts as their currency. But I was struck by your observation in one of your recent pieces that that's just not how humans work, and that facts might not be the most sensible starting point for sharing the news. Can you talk about that, about your evolution in thinking as a journalist and how it might apply to news about refugee issues?
Yeah, I mean, I think even hearing you say that right now makes me sad, and it's true. But I have a lingering love affair with facts. And like a lot of journalists believe, if I can just pluck the right facts out and shine them up and display them, you will believe. And especially in times of conflict, or especially in times of intractable or high conflict, that doesn't work and often has unintended counterproductive effects. Humans, there's a great book by Jonathan Haidt where he talks about, called The Righteous Mind, which I highly recommend. And he talks about how humans are just wired to be driven by intuition and emotion. And then we use reason to justify those feelings, right? So my dream is to one day be able to read and consume journalism that is based on how humans actually process information, because I feel like we need to evolve for what psychology has taught us about how people actually process the world around them, especially when they are anxious, especially when they are afraid. So when we talk about refugees in particular, we know that whenever people feel anxious, uncertain, afraid, they will tend to be very vulnerable to conflict entrepreneurs who give them an explanation for their pain that blames someone else, right? And there is something reassuring in that clarity for all humans. And often, unfortunately, it is refugees who become the narrative of blame. So how do we immunize people against that manipulation? And I think part of where we have to begin, and I definitely do not have the answers, but where I've tried to begin is to start from the reality that people are vulnerable and afraid and anxious, or my readers or my viewers are, right? Whether they should be or not, that is what it is. And so what then? How do we take what we know about human behavior and try to be useful and tell stories that will open people up, revive curiosity in a time of false simplicity? And I can talk more about the specific ways to do that, but I think that's kind of the big aspiration, right? Is to help people resist conflict entrepreneurs and narratives of blame that are very magnetic in times of change.
Yeah, I think you're being very modest here, because you have talked about ways that we can do that, and you've made a very compelling case that one of the few things that helps to create the space for understanding when people whether they're anxious or fearful, they're dug into opposing sides. And one of the things that works to get progress there is complicating the narrative. And so I'd really appreciate it if you could explain to everyone what that means and how and why it works.
Well, so there's been some really cool research by Peter Coleman and his colleagues at Columbia University, where they study how people interact when they're in conflict. And one of the most intriguing and hopeful things they discovered is that you can prime people for complexity and curiosity. You can, if you expose them to a news story about some controversy, and it is, two sides, us versus them, the usual traditional news story, then they're more likely to have unhelpful, unhealthy conflict in the difficult conversations lab, which they've set up for these studies. If, however, you have them read a news story of the same length, which is about the same thing, but it acknowledges the actual complexity over an issue, that in fact there are not two camps over Brexit or the Colombian Peace Treaty or abortion or any number of controversial issues. In fact, that many people feel internal conflict about these things, that there are more like 6 or 7 different groups if we had to create groups. And then people are much more likely to have what we might call good conflict conversations, where they still disagree. That's not the problem, right? But they ask each other questions. There are flashes of understanding, even humor, and then they're back to frustrated and angry. And it's sort of there's a sense of movement, which is where conflict is really transformative and useful and exciting. So that's what you're trying to get. And so, this idea of complicating the narratives means, well, first of all, we have to know what the narrative is, right? For a given audience or population. What is the narrative, and where does our reporting show that narrative is accurate or inaccurate? Where's the gap? And then it's about, one of the things that I find really useful is to do stories about different sources than we would normally use. So that might be, when we train journalists, we talk about the changed source, somebody who has changed his or her mind, right, about something, or the unsure source, like somebody who's just like, what, this is really complicated, and some days I feel this way, and the next day I feel this other way, or the unexpected source. Just a quick example, I recently did a story for Politico magazine about a group of refugees, about 30 female Afghan refugees who were trained up as special operators to work alongside Army Rangers and Green Berets in Afghanistan, and are now scattered across the United States trying to reinvent their lives. So what's useful about this story is that it takes everyone who's reading it pretty much by surprise, because these women have more combat experience than almost any living American soldier. And they're Afghan women, and they're Muslim, and they are dressed very conservatively, typically, and they had families who allowed them and encouraged them to do this very dangerous thing, which is to go along on midnight raids with US forces throughout Afghanistan. And now they are heartbroken and starting often alone in very random places in the United States. So it's a way to interrupt people's assumptions, right, about refugees or any given story by shining a spotlight on someone they don't know or expect or understand, but it makes you curious.
That's so interesting. And that was another great story that you've written recently, and it did exactly that for me. Tom, I want to turn to you now because sort of conventional wisdom about PR and advocacy strategies is that you've got to be simple, the slogan, the motto, and using complication would seem to go against all that assumed wisdom. Is that how you see it? And where do you see nuance or complicating the narrative or complicating something being useful in your advice?
First off, thank you for having me. It's a pleasure to be here. Amanda, there was a lot in what you said that chimed. So I got into this kind of world about 6 years ago. And well, September 2016 was when we set up the company in the wake of the EU vote. The Righteous Mind was quite formative in shaping how we think about it. And then George Lakoff's Don't Think of an Elephant, which I was reminded of as you were speaking. There's a quote in that book. He says something like, when the facts don't fit the frames are kept and the facts are ignored. In other words, facts don't change the way people think. And if we constantly communicate with fact-based communication, we're not going to change the way they think, quite the opposite. They will then use those facts to support their existing frame, which presumably is the one that we're trying to change. And I guess this feeds into this idea of complicating narrative, which I like conceptually. I enjoyed that explanation. It worked for me. I think we think about this in terms of breadcrumbs, which I guess is another way of exploring it, maybe from a similar but different way, in the sense that if we're trying to get someone engaged in a specific topic that they may not already be engaged in, it's quite hard to give them something meaty. So we do a lot of work with policy organizations who publish big reports, 50+ page reports. Trying to get someone to engage with a 50-page report from the outset when they have no kind of prior engagement with this topic isn't exactly the best way of approaching that from a communications point of view. So we try and, breadcrumb, right? Ladder up stages of engagement, get them to engage with something small, bite-sized piece of content that's framed well. So to the values point, to Jonathan Haidt's point, how do we tap into their existing framing of the subject, tap into why their values would support this frame and this narrative, and then get them to engage to a deeper and deeper level. Hopefully, I mean, I like to the point where you could have that piece, Amanda, that you were talking about, where you have competing points of view and you're getting people to debate it and actually take this on in a more thorough fashion.
Thanks. And as somebody who's often asked to engage people in long reports, I've read a lot of your work and seen your content online with great interest. Batoor, I want to turn to you because your film is such a great example of complicating the narrative. It is deeply human with all the complications that brings, about you, about your fellow asylum seekers, the smugglers, the advantages you might have had, the different quote-unquote endings of each person's story. And I wonder, were you tempted to make it a simpler one-man overcoming adversity story, that sort of traditional Hollywood formula for attracting the biggest audience?
Yeah, that's a good question, Lauren. First of all, the film production, like that was my first film experience, and it was a very lengthy process that at some points I kind of got tired. So it took me a very long time to complete it. But I think my aim was to show the real picture of migration, but also based on the, as I mentioned, the values-based messaging, not only the factual correctness or what is happening, but also to communicate human to human emotions, connections, and stories. You see the characters in my film, like those who are telling these stories. For instance, there are people in my film who have been, one family have been through 4 terrorist attacks, lost one member, they got injured several times, and everyone can connect to that. Or people who are separated from their loved ones, especially children. They are hoping that I wish I can meet or hear the voices of my kids for the last time. Yeah, in the middle of the Indian Ocean. So these are everyone can connect to that. So that is we need to change, they are human, how they have been portrayed wrongly in this discussion to the wider public. I think that was important, because when I came to Australia, I was resettled in 2013. I was surprised how negative the narration or narrative about people seeking asylum or refugees were. As soon as I came, I was being invited to come and give talks, and I met people who were had very negative thoughts about refugees and people seeking asylum and all. I would watch news, and it was all about the political campaigns. It was just before that election that Labour lost. It was all about refugees, boat turnbacks. It was looked like refugees were the villains of the movie. They are here to smash Australia. That was the thing. And through this film, my whole intention was to give that human element to that, like who are they, what they are going through, what are some of the challenges they are facing, and all those stories, like from like I didn't want to focus it all on myself, but like to bring stories that people can connect to this, and like so people can get more educated and get more awareness about refugees and those who risk their lives. Why do they come here? So because we, like at that time, we were hearing a lot like economical migrants and illegal and those sort of stuff. And yeah, I tried to kind of tackle all those issues in that way, through the stories of people to portray. Yeah, it was difficult, but I got it there.
I'm curious, when you first arrived and there was such a negative feeling and you went and spoke to those groups, could you actually see a change in the room when you were doing that, just by having that personal connection?
I think yes. Even like when I speak, like I spoke at one particular event at an RSL club, and I think it was around Frankston area. At that time, I was just very new. I didn't know the areas. I was invited to speak to this group of retired people, like who were retired, and so I spoke to them and like shared my story, and very like plainly, like my own experience, personal experience, and at the end, a lot of people, they came and like all like from the audience to meet and greet and like say their like how they felt. In particular, one woman, an old woman, she came and said like, I was so anti-refugees, like I didn't want you people to come to Australia, but after listening to your story, I've changed my mind, because what I was hearing through the media or like politicians, like they were not correct. You're different. So that was my like, oh, great, like this is really impacting people, like personal stories. I never thought, I never shared my personal stories in public before. So they were like just the beginning. And I was, wow, this is powerful.
Wow, that's great. That's great. And it's such a wonderful story when somebody admits that they've really changed their view, not just that they enjoyed your chat. And that's a very hard thing to do. So Tom, I really want to turn to you, because I'm trying to figure out how we reach beyond supporters here. And in your line of work, you're often trying to influence or shift the public conversation. And I'm afraid, do we have to talk about social media platforms? I think we do. Two Australian writers, Waleed Ali and Scott Stevens, recently described social media's algorithmic logic as the virality of evil. And so often I think that's what we experience when we're on there, and yet we need to use it as a tool. And can you tell me how social media play into your strategic advice?
Thought you were going to ask me what's happening with Twitter. What's Elon doing?
Well, if you know, please tell us that too.
So I guess with every channel, the starting point is, what's your audience? Who are you trying to reach? And where do you reach that audience? And more often than not, social media is one way through which you get to them, just because of its size, and like everyone's on, well, not everyone, the large majority of populations are on social media in some way, sense or form. I think one of the common mistakes we see clients make is assuming that because they're on a specific platform, and Twitter is often the guilty platform when we talk about social, because they're on it, other people are on it too. And Twitter, just as the example, is a very elite network. There are relatively few people on it. They tend to be quite in quite specific kind of bubbles. Whereas something like Facebook has a much wider public appeal. So when you're trying to do a more mass market campaign, you're much more likely to go to something like Facebook than to Twitter, or indeed LinkedIn, or the other more niche networks. But yeah, I guess as with all comms, it comes down to who you're trying to reach and what you're trying to get them to do. So for example, we're running a campaign at the moment that's targeting 5 very specific politicians. there is no need to do anything on social media to do that. We've hired billboards on vans and we've parked them outside their parliamentary offices so that they really see the message loud and clear. So I think it's being strategic about what you do and how you do it.
Can I just ask, like, Tom, what is the message? Like, I'm dying to know. Sorry, Lauren.
This project is around how do we reframe obesity in among UK parliamentarians. So we've had in the UK and indeed many other countries had progressively worse levels of obesity. Successive, I mean, in the UK, we've had 700 policies to try and deal with this in the last 30 to 40 years, none of which have had any impact. And the problem is largely that we think about it on an individual basis when actually it's a much more structural problem. It's much more around the environments within which people live and the stimulus that they have. So as someone that used to work for corporate and consumer communications and large firms that spend a lot of money marketing to people, it's really effective. And if you put people in an environment where they're on their, children on their phones on Facebook getting battered by ads left, right, and center about buying McDonald's or whatever it is, they are much more likely to end up over consuming. In the UK, kids that are obese by 12, 80% of them never get out of that. They're obese for the rest of their lives. So it's a massive structural problem. So the ads are around trying to change these specific, or it's a pilot campaign. How can we change these specific parliamentarians and how they think about obesity, essentially? Can we get them to look at it as a structural problem? And I guess what's relevant to this conversation, going back to the framing kind of piece, is how can we frame it so that it aligns with their political beliefs? These are not traditional, these politicians aren't necessarily the typical people that you'd go to support something like this. So we're testing whether we can bring them on board despite the fact that they're perhaps not the normal allies.
And what do they say?
It's TBD, we'll see. The evaluation starts in 2 weeks.
Okay, gotcha. And maybe I would invite the audience to start submitting your questions because there's just so many ways we could go with all of this. I want to talk to you, Tom, about how you engage Facebook without a lot of money when it's such a pay-to-play kind of network at the moment. And maybe, Amanda, you can take that in or take this in a different direction, because I really want to quote you directly. You've written in High Conflict that the challenge of our time is to mobilize great masses of people to make change without dehumanizing one another. So how do we do that?
Right, yeah. So I think one of the things that I find really exciting right now is to think about how we can create communities that have guardrails in place so that we keep conflict healthy, right? And I think social media is a great example of this. Like, I am happy to complain about social media. I could do it all day long, but I think I've also noticed that there are certain sub-communities within different social media channels that are delightful, where people treat each other like humans, where they can disagree and still be curious about each other, right? And still show each other some common decency, where they know what they don't know, right? Where they're wondering what else is out there. And there's a spirit of awe and curiosity and joy even. I've seen that, right? I think we all have. But here's the important thing. Those things are designed that way, and they're the exception. You can design a room, a gathering, a group of people, a company to bring out those things, right, in humans. And you can design an algorithm to do the opposite. So I'm actually very confident that humans can do this. We've done it many, many times. And I actually see that there's such pent-up demand for that I'm hopeful there will be a way to, if not make it profitable, then at least make it possible. I don't buy the argument that there's no way to do this without just monopolizing people's eyeballs in the most base and destructive ways. I think that's kind of a cop-out. So what I do see are just a ton of people who are yearning for connection and community, and not getting it through a lot of the sort of traditional social media and news media outlets. So I'm really not answering your question, you may have noticed, but I am trying to be hopeful.
Yeah, I think that you're right about that human yearning, but we're actually up against much more powerful forces in some ways than we've ever had to cope with before as humans.
Right. Yeah, no, I think one of the things we're up against is just the inundation of messaging, right? Like, I think people are aware of every terrible thing that's happened and could happen in a way that they weren't before. And I do not think that is how humans have evolved to function. And particularly in a pluralistic, diverse community, it's very hard to be bombarded with threats all the time. So something that has to change, I think, and this is my bias, is the way we cover the news and how we decide what is news. And there are, in my experience, 3 things that are missing from a lot of traditional, even very rigorous news reporting. And those 3 things are hope, agency, and dignity. So those are things that we know now that humans need to thrive in the modern world. And people want those things. They want hope, agency, and dignity, and not false hope, right? But hope that is, rooted in actual experience. And they're not getting it, right? So those is an example of things that would help us, I think, navigate a world in which we are very interdependent and we need each other. I mean, we just cannot solve big problems if we keep demonizing each other in this way.
Yeah, I think it's especially challenging for young people who grow up with so much more awareness than experience, and how they navigate that.
That's a good point.
And I think with all the hopefulness that you're all bringing to this, I want to ask you each in different ways how we can identify or even create moments when change can happen, and how we can be ready for that. So maybe, Tom, in your particular sort of approach, where do you see new kinds of engagement, and how in particular can think tanks or researchers or civil society take a more productive role in creating the conversation where that can happen, and what in your view do we need to do differently?
That's a good question. So I think in terms of moments when change can happen, they tend to be things that you don't have any influence over. There tends to be some kind of exogenous shock that happens, and an opportunity presents itself. And I think a lot of the time it's about being prepared for that opportunity to present itself. I think probably a component part of that is thinking long term. So often in the communications world, clients turn up and they say, can you change this narrative in 3 months? And the answer is like, no, it just doesn't work like that. You need to think a lot more long term if you want to actually affect real social change in terms of how people perceive and conceptualize an issue. You need to think about how you're framing the debate, and that starts with understanding. I can't remember, Amanda, I think it was you, but Batoor, it might have been you. But starts with understanding your audience and like knowing how they relate to the topic at hand before you start talking to them. So like, how do they think about this, and therefore how can I engage them through that lens so that it's going to instinctively feel right to them when I do, and they're not just going to immediately reject whatever it is that I'm saying. And I guess the third bit is, I guess, more of a political point, which is recognize that we don't exist in a bubble. So often when you have policy specific areas of expertise, those policy experts tend to only look at the world through that singular policy lens. If we want to affect political change, we need to recognize that political choices are difficult, and you often have competing requests for the same resources. So how do you convince whoever it is the decision maker is that your policy request is more important or is worthy of that resource versus the other competing demands on their resources and their time. So recognizing that we don't exist in a vacuum and that we need to take into account a much broader social context if we're going to actually have success when that exogenous shock does come in getting our particular policy change through, because it's the right thing to do.
That's so important and really valuable. And I wonder if it's not a good time to bring in an audience question, and any of you can jump in here. And someone asked, in the political sphere, it feels like misinformation is intentional. A narrative is generated. And this seems surprisingly to be very effective. You can hear it in the political sound bites that are reproduced even among friends and colleagues. And the question is, how are they so effective, and how can we undermine that effort? Tom, I might put you on the hot spot there.
It's not an easy question to answer. Sorry, I'm just scrolling back to the Q&A to reread. Was this on the Q&A section?
It was, and it's a big one about misinformation. So I actually might give you all a chance to think about it. And I'm going to put Batoor on the hot seat instead with another question, because
I can answer, say quickly about this. I think what I was referring to earlier was about the values-based messaging, which ASRC commissioned a research a couple of years ago to do, in how to counter this negative narrative, which is very really, it was really working until that point. And those even refugee movement and refugee activists were being trapped by that narrative. So we wasted all our energies in kind of countering those narratives. For instance, they were saying refugees were illegal, and we were saying, no, we are not illegal, we are legal. So in terms of that was not working well. And that research, I hope the link will be shared. So for Words That Work, it was called Words That Work, and to how we can counter that, but without countering it. So that was the values-based messaging, personal stories, connection between how others can feel connected, can put themselves in someone else's shoes, in that position, how they would feel. For instance, if I say not this, then probably that negative connotation or impression will remain in that mind. But if I say something more positive about myself, then it will make a different impact on the minds, rather than we saw clearly, and we still at the election campaign or after that, Peter Dutton's wife said Peter Dutton is not monster, but we think that he the monster word was remained in our mind, so we think he's a monster. Okay, we forgot the not one, but we kind of, everybody thought, oh, he's a monster. But yeah, I mean that is how it worked for refugees as well. So not to use that all energy into countering that, but to go on the positive side, and so that way I think it might help into changing the narrative. And another research was done after that, and the results showed that it made a great change and impact, how the support base, those who were undecided people about refugees, they have changed positions, and they were more supportive of the cause, and they were not being trapped by the politicians and media, those who were countering, or some of the media, not all, but yeah.
Yeah, that's the thing. And again, it goes back to Tom's point about taking a long-term view. One refugee story or two refugee stories is not going to make a difference. The hero, the tragic, poor situation, but they all add up. to create a complicated picture, which maybe gives us that entry that Amanda talks about for changing people's mind. And Amanda, I really want to go to you directly on this idea of moments of change, because I know, as in Australia, in the US, refugees really seem to be pawns in a larger partisan, sometimes racist, sometimes nativist politics in the US. I mean, I used to live on Martha's Vineyard, so I watched recent events with interest. And I'm wondering, is that how you see this discussion in the US? And if so, where do you see opportunities to get beyond that?
Yeah, I mean, I think Tom is right that you have to prepare in advance for the kinds of shocks that disrupt high conflict systems. And there's different ways to prepare. A lot of it is relationship building. So you have to find credible messengers who are trusted by the audience you're trying to reach and have relationships with them so that they see, refugees as humans before everything gets disrupted or everything goes to hell or whatever the shock might be. So a lot of that is not just being reactive, but actually planning for those disruptions. And I also say, look, I mean, we know some things about humans, right? One thing is, unfortunately, we tend to be very groupish, right? We will form groups and then be protective of our group and sometimes put our group above another group and all of these things we know, right? We like to scapegoat, especially when we feel threatened. And we also know that we don't like to be manipulated. So one of the things that the research has shown is that when you expose for people how they are being manipulated by people in power or people making money, it is not a good feeling. And if you offer them a way to show defiance, right, by rebelling against those manipulations, it tends to be much more effective than we might expect. So a quick example, going back to the obesity issue, actually, there was a really nice study that was done a few years ago that looked at how to get teenagers to start eating more healthy food. And, a million things have been tried, like Tom was saying in the UK, a million things, and none of them work. And in this case, what they did was took a cue from the effective advertising against smoking, tobacco, years ago, to try to tell teenagers a story. In this case, they had a pretty large group of teenagers and a control group, and the treatment group were given a short article to read about how big companies are manipulating young kids to get them to eat food that has a lot of sugar and salt sort of laced into it that makes you want more and more. And then these ads are targeting kids, right? And by doing this, they raised up a sort of natural sense of defiance that all teenagers and adults have, right? Which is they don't want to be played. Nobody likes to be played, right? And they could track what the kids ate for the next year because they could see what they were buying at the cafeteria using their school cards, And so it was a very cleverly designed study, and they found that this intervention worked, that it lasted over the year, and it worked especially well with boys, which was interesting. So the lesson here is one way to help people see that they're being manipulated is to keep showing them in story form that they're being manipulated. We are being turned against one another when it suits powerful interests and politicians. And this is a very old story, right? Like this is not a new thing. So are there ways to tell that story that are refreshing, that don't make us defensive for our side, right? Or our pre-existing identities that call on us to be independent thinkers and to not be chumps, so to speak.
Have you maybe, not right, you could put in the chat or let us know for later, if you've seen any examples of that really good storytelling in journalism, because we all know we're being played in so many ways, examples of how that is brought to us in a fresh way. And I might turn to another question from the audience, this one from for Batoor, and I'll just read it because it's really well done. Storytelling can support the changing of hearts and minds, but it can also be re-traumatizing for people. It can also set the expectation that it's okay for strangers to ask any refugee about everything, even the most difficult parts of their journey. And I see this often and really apologize for the times that's happened to people who are present on this call. The question continues, you get asked things that people would not normally ask strangers or people who aren't refugees, and says that they've experienced this. I find it outstanding that people who I don't know can ask such personal questions, and I get offended when I don't, and they get offended when I don't want to answer. Batoor, do you have any suggestions on how we can change this?
Yeah, I think that's a very important question. So, like, this is true. Asking refugees about their personal stories of how they have suffered, why they suffered all the time, can be very traumatizing and can be very tiring. Or we have to change that perception as well. Like, refugees are supposed to tell their stories, their miseries, like they should also portray all the time, to be in need of support or fear, I don't know what is the word, or maybe kind of in the mode of that refugee mode, or kind of they are still suffering, or they have to, or they are supposed to tell that story time and again. I think that should change a bit. It is not for the entertainment sake, but for and they are not supposed to do that. Of course, it is important to change narratives to raise some awareness in order to sharing some of those personal stories, but we should respect that many might not feel comfortable doing this. So, and it is not okay to ask people or maybe to do that, because it can be extremely triggering for a lot of people, and we have seen a lot within the communities who have been impacted. And I think just like everyone else, we should treat them with dignity, and they bring much more than their refugee experiences to this country or any other country. They are great achievers. They probably, you might see a lot of good sports people, good artists. They might have a beautiful voice to sing for you. They might do a good quick sketch of your picture, so compliment that, what they're bringing. Maybe they can do a good design for your home, or architect, or maybe they can set your interior design very beautifully and with the Eastern touch, so probably compliment that, like anyone else. They are similar. So I think just we should go a few steps beyond their refugee experiences. So they have much more to share.
It's so important to remember that none of us is a character, and even when we're dealing with communications and messaging and narratives, we're in the end a collection of human beings. And we have a great collection of human beings from all different walks of life in the audience. So I'm going to ask you all for a really brief thing that I know everyone always wants to know out of these panels, which is, what can each of us do right after this panel to start changing the refugee narrative? And we'll end with that. And I'm sorry for the questions that we haven't answered. We'll do a quick wrap after that. Who wants to start? What do we do to change the narrative today, this week?
Well, I really would like to pick up on what Batoor said, that I think is something that I've had to learn. I wish I had known it sooner, but it is very important, I think, to ask refugees for help, for their help. Can you help us with this? What do you need? What can you do? What can you help us get better at, right? And whether you're asking as a journalist or as a neighbor, I think there's so much talent and experience and wisdom and, my God, just, strength in the refugees that I've been able to know, and constantly asking them or acting like they need all the help is infantilizing at some level, and also you just miss out on a lot of opportunity. So are there ways at scale to do that? I think, one way to do that is journalism, right? Is telling the stories of how are refugees helping our neighborhood or our school. I remember covering a story in a school in Texas, I think it was, where the refugee students were like just raising up the whole average for the test scores for this school. And it was like just so exciting for the teachers, and so stories like that, which show the real agency that refugees have and bring, and the assets that they are. I know that sounds obvious, but I feel like there's a lot more that could be done there.
Tom, you want to jump in next?
I'm not sure that I feel sufficiently qualified to give a view on that. I have a gut feel, which is like, how can you reframe the debate and appeal to non-traditional audiences to build, like, what could you do to identify ways of bringing non-traditional audiences alongside? And I guess the way that I would, if I was going to start doing this tomorrow, I'd essentially commission a bunch of research of like exploring the relationship that the political opponents have to a more progressive refugee policy or whatever it is, and like delving into what the values problem is there. Like, what is it that instinctively feels wrong to them about that policy, and then trying to find a way around that. I think that's probably where I'd start.
Great. And Batoor, what do you think's missing? Or what can we do more of?
Probably, I think I have a bucket of suggestions. Probably, let's start with the. I would love to and my film is currently touring Australia screenings. So I'm hoping I can do more screenings, so it can reach to as much people as possible. And if anyone in the audience wants to collaborate or partner, definitely this is a way you can support as well, to send the messages around. And also beside that, there is support refugees around you, center their voices, support them. They should lead and they should be heard. They have to they need support. Follow them on social media, amplify their voices, what they are saying, what they want. We have 31,000 people who are living in limbo. They are crying on social media. They need support, and we haven't still had any action from this government after a decade of punishment to them. And we have thousands of refugees stuck in limbo in Indonesia. So we can amplify those voices. And also the other thing, I think ASRC offers trainings of that values-based messaging that I said. So if anyone is interested, reach out to ASRC. I conduct those workshops and tell more and more people to learn about this, how we can battle this negative narrative and make a positive change. I think that is a few steps that you can help.